Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Corey, better known as the Seaman, and I want to welcome you to another Spooktober edition of the Seaman's Cinema Sit Down. We are smack dab in our vampire week of our Spooktober run. We just talked about arguably the greatest Dracula movie ever made, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. Bram Stoker's Dracula. If you want to see my thoughts on it, you can see them right up there. But now we turn our attention to a vampire movie that I came to a little bit late in the game. I used to be really anti-Brad Pitt. I thought he was just a pretty boy actor. And when I was a kid, for whatever reason, I just didn't like him. And then I saw the first thing that got me going with Pitt was Fight Club. And then I started diving into the back catalog. So like 7, I was like, yo, this dude is way better than I used to give him credit for. And now, of course, he's one of my favorite actors. And being a vampire fan, it was very natural to find myself enjoying the heck out of this one. What am I talking about? Why don't you pull up a chair, take a seat. We're getting ready to dive in spoiler-free-ish into Interview with the Vampire. Vampire Chronicles, I believe, is like the full name of the movie, which comes to us from director Neil Jordan and writer Anne Rice, and as I said, features Brad Pitt in a pretty stellar performance, you know, and it's one of those, like I said, for whatever reason, I didn't think Pitt was like that good. I always thought it was like, oh man, people just love this guy because he's a pretty boy, and then when you watch the dude actually act, he's phenomenal. And like I said, being a vampire fan, I was drawn to this when I saw it on his catalog list because Tom Cruise is also in this movie. I'm a pretty big Tom Cruise fan, and I gotta say, from an acting standpoint, I really enjoy pretty much all the performances in this one. I think Tom Cruise chews the scenery like few can in a movie like this, and he really is, of the actors that we get, the guy who goes full tilt into the enjoyment and just some of the ridiculous things that a character of his nature can go to. And for me, that's super enjoyable to watch Cruise, do. Specifically now, in a world where all Tom Cruise does is action movies, and specifically like pretty much just Mission Impossible movies, it seems like at this point. And that's fine. I've said the same thing with Denzel, where like Denzel just goes out and makes the movies he wants to make because legend. He did all the work to be able to make any movie you want to make, and that's totally cool. But Tom Cruise is a really, really good actor, and it's been a while since I've seen him do anything like this. So rewatching Interview, I was like, dude, he's having so much fun. Like, we need to find like an action role for Cruise where he can tap into some of this. And it's one of those things where like these two guys, are your main leads. They're phenomenal. But even still, like while enjoying their performance, that first act of the movie doesn't quite click until Claudia shows up, played by a very young and very talented Kirsten Dunst. And you could argue that she steals the entire movie. The minute that Claudia shows up, I think the script gets more interesting. I think the performances get better, specifically because of the attachment that you have and just the relationship between Pitt and Cruise and Dunst on screen is something I really, really enjoy watching. And when you watch Pitt's Louis and Dunst's Claudia in particular, like, I love how close they are. I love what they mean to each other. I love what they represent for each other. And as the story goes, I mean, you're talking about a kid vampire, right? So like Claudia can never age, and it's one of the interesting things you don't really see too much in the world of vampires, but like when she tries to cut her hair, it grows right back. Like, she cannot be anything than what she is, frozen in time. And that's a super interesting concept. And as you advance the story forward throughout the interview, and you start jumping time, and they've been together 30, 40 years, it's a really, really unique dynamic, and Dunst is just stellar. But then you also have Christian Slater in here. It was supposed to be River Phoenix, but after his passing, Slater stepped into the role of Malloy, who is our journalist who is interviewing Pitt's, vampire, Louis. And, they don't ask, obviously, Slater to do a ton. He's really kind of at the very beginning, he's at the very end, and sprinkled throughout as Pitt tells the story. But he is a nice sounding board to kind of counter Pitt, because Pitt is so here the whole movie that, like, as you get to the end and you get a little bit more out of Slater with Malloy's character, he kind of goes to the opposite end of the spectrum. You know, it's that, like, you have Cruise's Lestat up here, you have Pitt's Louis kind of like more here, and same thing with Slater. He's a little bit more up here. He reacts a little bit more. And in the very little that he's given to do, you know, I think he does a fine enough job. But the other standout and person to call attention to, of course, is Antonio Banderas, who plays the vampire Armand at the end of the movie. You know, someone that Pitt's Louis comes across, is infatuated with. And as him and Claudia have just kind of been roaming Europe looking for other vampires, he is that in. And I think Banderas does a phenomenal job of being a very seething kind of hero. Like, say, very similar to what Louis is as far as, like, range emotionally, but a lot more seething, a lot more deviousness to things that, you know, Armand may or may not have going on with his, you know, kind of coven, or, you know, with his kind of clique of vampires that he has. But the performances across the board in this one I find to be fairly stellar. And I think what, you know, you get out of Neil Jordan from behind the camera is good stuff, man. I mean, he paints, you know, obviously it's a very broad stroke as you span a lot of time, but I think he paints very real-world settings. You know, when we're in New Orleans for good chunks of time, feels like we're in, you know, a more colonial New Orleans. When he's in Paris and in different places, like, I enjoy all the settings that we're in, and I enjoy the way that he shoots and paces the movie. Like I said, it's one of those where the movie kind of lends itself obviously to its actors and the performances. You know, Jordan's got to do a good job of carrying that and making sure the momentum of not a whole lot of action going on in a movie like Interview, you know, continues to move. And I think the pacing and, like I said, the direction and the style that Jordan brings to it really works for the vibe that you're trying to present. And then you have Anne Rice's screenplay, and I think it's a very strong screenplay. You know, for me, this has always been one of those kind of classic vampire movies that I love to throw on after stumbling into it a little bit late. And it is a lot of the time because of those performances. But I think what Rice does, you know, it lends itself to a community back in, this was in 1994, where, you know, you didn't see a lot of representation for LGBTQ characters. And I think given the, you know, where we are in the world in 1994, maybe this is as much as Rice and Jordan thought they could pull off, but the homoeroticism in this movie is very, very strong. And if there was a knock or something that, like, if you were to revisit Interview with the Vampire at some point in time, I would just like to see the movie fully commit to that stuff, right? Like, there is a lot of homoeroticism between Pitt and Cruise and Pitt and Banderas, and they never go there, you know, but you can see it. I mean, just the vibe and the way that they interact, there is more than just friendship between these characters. And when you're talking vampires, I mean, the lust factor, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual, is something that is so intriguing about the vampires. And they don't really tap into it as much as they could have had they fully committed to the idea of relationships between Lestat and Louis and Armand. And, you know, it's like one of those things where, like, you get close, but, like, none of them even share a kiss. Yet that sexual tension is so strong between all of them. I mean, when Cruise bites Pitt for the first time, you're just waiting for that to be followed up with, like, a full-on passionate love scene, and you don't get that. And there's been rumors that there, you know, maybe was a scene like that shot that maybe one day could, you know, appear in a director's cut, but it's the one element of the movie that I think if you were to revisit, I think as an audience member, I'd like to see you lean more into that because it's so obviously apparent. And had you leaned into that a little bit more, it would even make the relationship between Louis and Claudia that much more interesting. Now, that aside, I think what Rice does from a screenplay standpoint, as far as having a vampire like Louis who is conflicted with being a vampire, right? Like, he's in a situation where he's gonna die, and Lestat gives him the option. Like, I'll let you die, or I can give you the life that I have. And, you know, Louis never really comes around to the idea of murdering people, and he's never okay with it. You know, he lives off rats and vermin and animals more so than humans. And I think Rice does a good job of exploring what a vampire like that is doing in a world like the one that we're in. Now, granted, I think some people might say, well, why do you have Tom Cruise playing Lestat, who's supposed to be this European French vampire? And there's no real accents in this movie. I mean, Pitt's not even really trying to do a New Orleans accent, and that's one of those things where it seems like if you did this now, you'd probably lean into that more, but at least for me, it was nothing that ever took me out of the movie until, more recently, where you watch it, it's like, oh yeah, well, that isn't quite locked in, but those performances are really strong, and I love the counter, right? Like, Lestat is the person who leans fully into all of the just pleasure and things that make a vampire, and you have Louis, who's got this legitimate kind of moral compass and code, and it's one of those, like, even the concept of Claudia and her coming into existence as a vampire, how that affects Louis is something that I just love seeing the exploration of, because he's at a point where he needs to feed, and Lestat is trying to force him to feed, and he runs into an area where the plague is taking over, and he sees this young girl, both parents are dead, let me put her out of her misery, before she dies this slow death, and kill her, except he doesn't, and then Lestat turns her into a vampire. So, like, you end up with this relationship where, Claudia and Louis are very close, but Claudia occasionally drifts more toward things that Lestat was about. And just how that story unfolds and unravels, and how it leads us into, our stretch with Armand. It's just all really interesting exploration around the ideas of vampires. And like I said, someone like Louis, who has a bit of a moral compass, that's something I don't feel like he had seen really in this realm prior to Interview. And it's always the thing that I found most fascinating. Now, I think if you would have actually committed, I think, to some of those relationships between Louis and Lestat and Louis and Armand, I think that would just elevate the material, elevate the chemistry and the back and forth of what you're seeing on screen. But 1994, Jordan and Rice don't opt to go all the way there. And I think that probably now, when you look back and you watch the movie, it's just like, it's so obvious, just commit to it. But 94 was a different time. So I think this is a movie that, like, as a fan, I don't need it to be remade, because I do thoroughly enjoy Interview with the Vampire anytime I put it on. But I think if you were to revisit it and maybe remake it, I definitely think you could elevate some of the material that's there that doesn't get quite explored enough. But for me, I mean, this is just rock solid vampire entry into our Spooktober countdown. So that's all I got. Let's get the old C-Maniacs up and give this bad boy a score. For me, this is one where the acting is just top notch across the board. I mean, Pitt's brooding and just very almost monotonous yet internally conflicted Louis is just a character I love watching him play. And the idea of having him tell this story to a reporter, I think, is fascinating, and where it puts Louis in the context of vampires and vampires in the world and the type of vampire he is. It just leans into the things that Pitt is really, really good at, and then you opposite him and pair him with someone like Tom Cruise's Lestat, who can go to all of the range of emotions and just a much bigger range in the performance, because Lestat is eccentric and he is overly confident, and you're able to have a lot of fun with Cruise chewing on the scenery, even if he doesn't quite fit that, French European vampire that Lestat is supposed to be. I enjoy watching him chew the scenery, and same with Antonio Banderas. I mean, he comes in and he's a bit more broody like Louis, but he has a different viewpoint, and seeing him bounce off of Pitt is a lot of fun on screen. But the MVP standout in the acting realm for me is Kirsten Dunst. Claudia's entry immediately makes the movie much better than it is prior to her arrival, and what she does on screen chemistry-wise with both Lestat and Louis as you kind of go through this journey with them, it's just so impressive to watch from a young child actor. And granted, we know Kirsten Dunst now, with a full career, is a very, very talented actor. But back then, she only had a handful of roles, but anytime she popped up as a kid, it was one of those, like, this is someone who has a lot of talent. and she really is the shining spot of the movie for me. I think Neil Jordan does a great job in creating ambiance and atmosphere around these very interesting characters, and Rice, for the most part, gives a story that I think in 94 lent itself to a community that didn't get a ton, back then. And granted, there's a lot of homoeroticism that does not actually, we never see it followed through on, but it exists there, and it's obvious that those were there. And, I wish that you maybe would have leaned into it. I mean, even just a kiss somewhere could have elevated so much of that story. But I think what Rice does from the LGBTQ standpoint and the exploration of vampires for 1994, it gave us a story that, wasn't easily accessible, I think, in a lot of places. And that's to be commended, and is a story that I think if you revisited, you could really lean into now, and it could give you a different flavor for this one. But based off what we got for Interview with the Vampire, I got to go a solid 4 out of 5 Sea Maniacs. I know it's not a movie that everyone will love, but it's one that's always been near and dear to me. Once I started diving into Pitt's full catalog, and as a vampire fan, I could watch Pitt, Cruise, and Dunst play vampires literally all day long. So 4 out of 5 Sea Maniacs for the Seaman. That's all I gotta say. Now it's your turn. What are you thinking, man? Did you grow up watching Interview with the Vampire? Was this something you watched in 94? Something you watched maybe a little bit after because you were maybe too young? Where did this fall in the line of vampire filmography for you? And how did you take the movie? Is it something that it hurts the movie that you never see Lestat and Louis, actually have a relationship, or the same with Louis and Armand? Or is that something that you can kind of get around because you just enjoy the general story and what you're seeing? Do the performances pop for you? What does Jordan do behind the camera or Rice with the pen that, works or doesn't work for you? If you've never seen Interview with the Vampire, is this one that now is on your list now that we've talked about it? Have I intrigued you to want to maybe take a look at this one? Anything you got, man, good, bad, indifferent, on Interview with the Vampire goes down below in the comments section. Look forward to talking to you guys down there. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you're new, you want to come hang out with the Seaman the rest of Spooktober, see every other movie we're talking about in our vampire list. We got Fright Night coming up next. You want to be here for any of that coverage. Maybe you want to see what I got about Dune, because that comes out tomorrow. Maybe you just like when I'm talking movies, TV, trailer reactions in general, but you haven't, and now you want to show a little love support to this guy? Well, hey, come join C-Maniac Nation. Be here for all those goodies. Real easy. All you got to do is jump over there, hit that subscribe button, hit that little bell if you want those alerts, and until next time, for the C-Man Cinema, sit down. I've been the C-Man. I'm sounding off. Peace. Oh, hey, what's going on? You must be sticking around because you're looking for more content featuring this guy. Well, guess what? You're in the right place. You can check out more videos right here and right here. And if you have and you want to come join that C-Maniac Nation, you can hit that subscribe right over there.